might be told that recording is in progress. It certainly is, and I can edit out the beginning and end. So, hello everyone, good day. I would say good evening, but I know there's a lot of transatlantic friends in the room and people from all over. So, I'm going to spotlight myself for this recording and say, spotlight. So, welcome to tonight's Association for Scottish Literature event. I am Craig Lamont, Secretary of the Association, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker. So, Dr. Michael S. Newton was an assistant professor in the Celtic Studies Department of St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia from 2008 to 2013. He has written a multitude of books and articles about Gaelic culture and history, and is a leading authority on Scottish Gaelic heritage in North America. His anthology, Into the Fairy Hill, Classic Folktales of the Scottish Highlands, will be published later this year by McFarland. And forgive my non-use of Gaelic here, but with Wilson MacLeod, Michael co-edited The Highest Apple, an anthology of Scottish Gaelic literature in 2019, a very important and a very large book, totaling 813 pages. This anthology has helped contextualise and celebrate the rich history of Gaelic literature in Scotland. Michael's many books and projects have won awards and recognition for their importance in the field and for his continuous contribution to the preservation of Scottish history and culture, both in Scotland and North America. Michael's scholarship has also been used by producers, including the PBS documentary Voices Over the Water and the very popular Outlander series, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. Tonight, the title of Michael's lecture is The Portable Fairy Hill, the Scottish Gaelic Storytelling Tradition in the Highlands and the Nova Scotian Diaspora. Following the lecture, there will be some time for questions and comments. As I said, I'll look out for you in the chat if the connection allows for us to turn our videos back on and use our microphones, and you can speak to Michael directly after his lecture. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Michael S. Newton.
Kapalev. Just a quick note that I am traveling in Nova Scotia at the moment, and we're in a small government office that does not like my laptop. So I am reliant upon my friend Lewis McKinnon's cell phone, and I'm hoping it will keep up with the demands of the internet. And if there's any problems, I will just have to try to call back in. So apologies about the technological challenges here. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. So I'd first of all like to thank Duncan Jones for the opportunity to address you today on this rich and fascinating subject during 2022, which was designated as the Year of Scotland Stories. It was a fortuitous accident that I happened to undertake this project at just the right time. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank all of the people who have contributed to my engagement in Scottish Gaelic studies, my instructors and mentors at the University of Edinburgh many years ago, the tradition bearers and storytellers and proponents of Gaelic culture I've met with over the years in both Scotland and North America, and the many people with whom I have shared stories and discussed their meaning and relevance. This presentation is focused on the work that I've done to produce an anthology of Scottish Gaelic folk tales collected from oral tradition in both Scotland and Nova Scotia between the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I come to this work as a generalist in Scottish Gaelic studies and someone who has long attempted to build bridges between academia and the general public. Minoritized communities, such as that of the Gaels, are awash in misrepresentations and skewed perceptions, and I have attempted to address these problems in many previous books and articles by highlighting song poetry and oral narratives composed by Gaels, but this is my first attempt to create a volume specifically focused on the storytelling tradition. I taught a course in Scottish Gaelic folklore in about 2011 when I was at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, and I found it hard to find an appropriate course book to assign to students. On the one hand, there are several volumes of Gaelic folktales that were collected and published in the 19th century, and although these contain the most elaborate and eloquent versions of popular tales, The Gaelic primary texts are in desperate need of modern editions, and the English translations are often idiosyncratic and eccentric by modern standards, and sometimes contain errors. On the other hand, there are several volumes of folktales collected since the mid-20th century in Scotland and Nova Scotia. And while the range of genres in these modern collections is greater than those published in the 19th century, the variants are shorter and the corresponding tales collected a century or more earlier. And the original Gaelic texts are not always provided with English translations, along with the translations, I should say. The modern volumes have either represented fieldwork in Scotland or Nova Scotia, but not attempted to span the ocean. And even the modern volumes don't provide an adequate introduction to the subject of oral narratives in general, and the Gaelic storytelling tradition in particular, for teaching a course on the subject at a university level. There are also many excellent but neglected tales that appeared in Gaelic periodicals starting in the 1830s that deserve greater attention. And so I began this new project with those points in mind. I'll explain the title of the volume anon. It contains the original Gaelic text of 55 tales, with 67 tales in English translation, most of which are my own. I also wanted to represent the geographical span of the Gaelic-speaking world beyond the usual emphasis on the Hebrides and the western shores of the Highlands, showcasing materials from such places as Loch Lomond, Perthshire, Badenoch, and so on. It is easy to forget nowadays how widespread Gaelic communities were in the 19th century and how rich the storytelling tradition was right up to the Highland-Lowland divide. While Scottish Gaelic literature receives inadequate attention as a whole, the storytelling tradition itself is something of an underdog within this realm. The song poetry tradition monopolizes attention for several reasons. First, the song poetry was cultivated at a high level by the professional class of trained poets, whose work continued into the 18th century and continued to exert a strong trickle-down influence on tradition as a whole into the present. Second, the musical dimension of the song poetry allows even a non-Gaelic speaking audience to enjoy hearing it performed by an accomplished singer. Gaelic oral narratives, on the other hand, require high levels of linguistic competency to understand the tale and great patience and focus to follow it at pace when delivered orally. Although some of the tales are connected with literary activity at the elite level, many more reflect the lives of the Highland peasantry living in a rural society. The style and content of the tales contrast starkly with the conventions of the literature and mindset of modernity. Additionally, as I've summarized before, there is a need for better editions and translations of the tales. Despite this, some scholars have been very aware of the value and significance of vernacular oral narrative in Scottish Gaelic tradition. Take these comments from an essay by Professor Kenneth Jackson, head of the Department of Celtic Studies at the University of Edinburgh in 1952. In fact, Scottish Gaelic and Irish folklore is practically unique in the world in several respects. One is its extraordinary richness and its very high quality, particularly as compared with that of the rest of Western Europe. Another is its relatively large literary content. The medieval literature of the Gaelic people was the property of an educated professional class of men, one of whose functions was to entertain the chieftain and retainers in his hall. I have based the title of the forthcoming book, as well as this talk, on a comment made by my mentor, the late John McInnes, who was employed by the School of Scottish Studies for decades to collect and interpret Gaelic oral tradition. One of the many fascinating insights he shared about the symbolism of the fairy hill is that it is implicitly understood as providing a means of expressing ideas about creativity and the unconscious. Although fairy hills are features of the landscape, and there are places named Sheehan in Nova Scotia as well as Scotland, they are also powerful metaphors about tradition and the human mind. And as such, these metaphors are mobile and have been taken by immigrant communities far beyond the Highlands. One of the powerful aspects of the storytelling tradition is its its ability to connect, bridge, span, and reconcile. Stories connect Gaelic communities across the ocean. They have bound together the various social strata of Highland life, and they have been instrumental in cementing the bonds between human communities and the landscapes that they occupy. These are themes that I will attempt to expand upon later, but I will note now that the most important of these diasporic communities is in Nova Scotia, where I happen to be visiting at the moment. The size, density, and spread of Gaelic-speaking communities from the late 18th century onward in the Eastern Maritimes of Canada made this region a refuge and stronghold for tradition that has continued to the present day, albeit greatly diminished from its heyday several generations ago. One of the most interesting and culturally endowed families to come were representatives of the Macbuddy family, who had served as professional literati for various branches of the Clan Donald since the 15th century at least. I'll talk more about the family's interaction with the story tradition later. So what is meant by folk tales in the context of Scottish Gaelic tradition? The term is understood implicitly to mean tales told from memory for a live audience who is experiencing them orally. The tales belong to a community's sense of tradition, not composed by or reflecting individual authorship or ownership or personal idiosyncrasies. Although there were many occasions during which stories could be told, the primary occasion for them was the Céilí, the communal gathering held on the long dark nights roughly between Samhain, Halloween, and Bealtaine, May Day, when the young and old of a village would come into someone's home to share tradition. There are, of course, important caveats about creating boundaries that are artificially definitive and restrictive around the idea of vernacular oral tradition. First of all, there are many centuries of interaction between orality and written media for Gaelic literature. Tales read from manuscripts in the halls of chieftains were later brought into Céilís and entered oral tradition, and tales in oral tradition provided characters and plots for the native literati who produced manuscript texts. Secondly, international wonder tales such as Snow White, popular in many different cultural regions, were adopted within Gaelic tradition and adapted to its sensibilities. Third, travelers such as tailors and packmen were favorite guests at Céilís, and they brought new stories from place to place. Finally, the availability of cheap printed materials in both English and Gaelic in the modern period also brought new stories to eager audiences. I also want to emphasize the fact that the storytelling tradition is not flat or homogeneous, but consists of many different genres, strands, and themes. The Ulster and Fenian cycles are closely related to the native learned literary tradition, as are the medieval romances that entered oral tradition. There are also international wonder tales in the repertoire, as well as stories about saints, legends of the supernatural, fables, animal tales, and so on. Although the native Gaelic professional classes were busy composing literature for their own purposes, little attention was paid to the literary activity of the peasantry until relatively recently. The Highland elite began to compile chronicles about the origins and history of clans in the 17th century, and although most of these were written in Lowland Scots or English, there are many passages that were drawn from Gaelic oral tradition. The Ossianic controversy of the 1760s drew the attention of scholars to Highland tradition. A few prose narratives were captured by efforts to transcribe Gaelic oral tradition from the peasantry, although the emphasis was on song poetry that featured Fionn MacCool and the Fianna. Periodicals written in Gaelic began to appear in the 1830s with the beginnings of widespread literacy in the Highlands, and tales about clan battles and chieftains appeared sporadically in their pages. It is only in 1859 that fieldwork began to collect oral folk tales in a systematic way from the peasantry due to the initiative and enterprise of John Francis Campbell. Campbell organized and coordinated a network of literate field workers across the West Highlands and Hebrides that continued into 1861, resulting in a massive archive of transcriptions. Campbell published 4 volumes of these materials, the original Gaelic texts and English translations, and many more remain in unpublished manuscripts, now held in the National Library of Scotland. Campbell's venture resulted not only in a mass of physical documents, but also in a greater awareness of the value of Gaelic oral tradition and the inspiration of a crop of field workers who continued to glean what they could of the spoken word before it was smothered out of existence. Sorry, I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. The work of identifying tradition bearers and capturing their tales was difficult and complex, however. For one, many storytellers were out of practice, and it took time to jog and refresh their rusty memories. For another, storytellers could not easily slow down the pace of their delivery for people to write it all down, and the transcribers could not write fast enough to capture it all in real time. One of the common strategies was for the field workers to take rough notes as they listened, especially if there were important words or phrases in Gaelic that they wanted to reproduce, and then they would later reconstruct and write down the story from memory at their leisure. This was, of course, not the precise verbatim transcription possible nowadays with electronic equipment, but a compromise that some field workers felt necessary. Not only that, but church clergy and schoolmasters who disparaged folktales and belittled those who told stories had a tremendously negative impact on the tradition, to the point that many were terrified to admit that they knew any. Campbell and his crew described the cognitive dissonance and psychological trepidation of people who had internalized stigmas about Gaelic tradition, making the efforts of field workers much more difficult, if not impossible, in some communities. This is a classic statement from Hector Urquhart about this. The minister came to the village in 1830, and the schoolmaster soon followed, who put a stop in our village to such gatherings, talking about the Cayley. And in their place, we were supplied with heavier tasks than listening to the old shoemaker's fairy tales. From that period till I collected the few in this collection, I have not heard a tale recited. On going to visit my friends last summer, I expected that I would get some old tales among them, but I found that the most of the old men who used to relate them in my young days had died, and the few who were then alive of them were so old that they had lost their memories, so that I only got but a trifle to what I expected. Let's see. There are always counter currents, however. Although the overriding attitudes and values of institutions, such as church establishments, was hostile to secular oral tradition, some priests and ministers who were native Gaels themselves were much more sympathetic about the value of tradition and were absolutely instrumental in preserving it. The 3 men on this slide are exemplars of such cultural heroes. And as always, this is a complex and nuanced issue. However, as the official institutions of Anglo-Saxondom continued their relentless efforts to assimilate and homogenize communities in the name of progress and civilization, so did some Gaelic leaders attempt to organize its resources and voices to counteract those forces antithetical to its survival. I've highlighted on this slide some of the groups and periodicals that emerged at this time, who also published materials from oral tradition from which I've drawn from my volume. So I like to now turn to the style and content of the folktales themselves and highlight some of what I think makes them particularly interesting and valuable. Gaelic storytelling reflects Gaelic aesthetics and the love of verbal ornamentation. Many tales refer to or include excerpts from song poetry, and it is not unusual for dialogue to appear in the form of couplets or quatrains. The most unique of these poetic features are what is referred to in English as runs. These are conventional oral formula containing poetic features such as alliteration and rhyme, used to describe common actions or transitions in stories, and tend to be reused from tale to tale. Besides providing verbal ornamentation, it has been suggested that they allow the storyteller to go on autopilot while they prepare mentally for the next episode in the tale. The example that I give here, I'll just recite this very quickly. Hachar richel an asuin, mar vroalien haun droim a chuan, mar beim en beichgach blue richele, en basa leim haar train san clear, mar neel da chlachan melin garav, is gevoord na kid begevi. The storytelling tradition provides something of a window into the medieval Gaelic world, even if sometimes small and dim. The tales in general reflect the social and literary values and aspirations of the old native aristocracy, who were dominant in the medieval period. Many of the texts themselves feature historical figures and events that belong to the pre-modern period. Many tales display a preoccupation with explaining the origins of place names, family branches, songs, and tunes in a manner very reminiscent of medieval Gaelic literature, especially the genre that emerged in the early beginnings of the tradition known as Jean Henachas, the lore of places. Finally, just one moment. I have a sleeping dwarf in the room here. The dramatic dialogue, finally, the dramatic dialogue between characters, often as the exchange of insult, taunt, and challenge in poetic form, shows stylistic continuity with both medieval Gaelic and Icelandic literature. The legacy of the Macbuthic intelligentsia is central to consideration of these lines of continuity and the personnel responsible for the development of this literary tradition and its wider reverberations in Gaelic society, both in the Highlands and in the Diaspora. The tale known as Ectri Vanish, the Adventure of Manus, was considered one of the great masterpieces of Gaelic oral tradition, and the late Alan Bruford considered it to have been originally composed in manuscript form by one of the Macbuthics as a medieval romance tale that entered oral tradition. The wonder tale Canan na Nian is one of only two tales from the tract The Seven Sages to have been translated into Scottish Gaelic, probably by one of the Macbuthic dynasty. It was recorded from a descendant of the Macbuthic lineage in South Uist. There are Gaelic folktales about a composite character named Macbuthic Mór, emphasizing his supernatural powers and connections to the otherworld, reflecting the social status of the poets and the aura of mystery and awe around the profession. The folktale Shinachan Mór agus Gowan and Dan was recorded from one of the Macbuthic descendants in Nova Scotia in 1938. The tale resembles medieval tales about quests for magical weapons and arcane knowledge, but in this case, it is for the purposes of the mastery of literature, and it uses names, terms, and metaphors from the medieval tradition. These tales pointing to the involvement of the Macbuthic dynasty exemplify the entangled nature of social status and supernatural authority in Gaelic tradition. Of all of the cycles or genres in the Gaelic storytelling repertoire, the Fenian or Ossianic cycle is arguably the most popular and important. The warrior band were essentially representatives of the Gaelic world, inclusive of Ireland and Gaelic Scotland, personifying Gaelic values and ideals and protecting the territory from intruders and invaders such as the Norse and even Christian missionaries. Their vigorous defense of Gaelic lands and culture, even against authority figures such as St. Patrick, made them effective oppositional figures and native countercultural role models. One of the fun aspects of the textual work I did when preparing this volume was discovering Ossianic texts that are so racy and sexually explicit that they were previously expurgated or untranslated. Finally, there is hardly a community that was Gaelic speaking in the 19th century, from Loch Lomond side to Lewis, from Sutherland to Glen Shee, that does not contain place names that connect to and are explained by tales about the Fianna and Feuds. This conveys the idea that the Fianna lived amongst us, are commemorated by the names we use daily, and their reputation lingers on. The Gaelic storytelling repertoire also contains, of course, a massive amount of material that is classified by modern Anglophones as supernatural, although there is no such concept in the native Gaelic cosmology. The most significant otherworldly beings are the chieftains, translated crudely as fairies, and it must be emphasized that these tales were told and cultivated not only by the peasantry, but also by the elite, as they served to legitimate the authority and social status of the aristocracy and literati. Tales of the fairies are multifaceted and multivalent, and cannot be explained by any single unified theory. There are aspects of these tales that express ideas about social norms, human ecology, cosmology, and the ineffable, as well as ideas about creativity and the human experience. In summary then, Highland storytelling tradition keeps minds active, memories exercised, imaginations flowing, and ideals inspired. It provides a massive repertoire of symbols and archetypes that can be used to discuss a range of issues relating to the lives and experiences of Gaelic communities, which they did regularly in Ceilidhs. The storytelling tradition reinforces a communal sense of identity and history that is pan-Gaelic, although some elements are tied to local places and kin groups. It ennobles audiences by association with their high-status relatives from past times, and is a crucial channel for maintaining Gaelic values, ideals, and identity. The impression made by Highland storytelling on young minds is expressed in this letter written in 1836 to a Gaelic periodical, which I excerpt here in my own translation. Note the somatic dimensions of his experience. The tales are imbibed like nutrients and have physical effects on the listeners. The son sat on his father's knee as he listened to tales, creating a bond of physical affection. He also speaks of stories as inspiring the audience to follow their ancestral tradition and as elevating their sense of self-worth. These notes from a field worker in 1857 provide some further fascinating comments. It is still considered good practice in a Ceilidh to relate the line of transmission through which you received and learned a song or story. And this creates a kind of cultural family tree that connects you to those carriers of tradition who enabled a story or song to come to you. And it's also striking that this tradition bearer, like so many others, considered himself to have no higher calling in life than to recite the materials he knew to an attentive audience. He gave a higher priority to that duty than to anything else in his life. I'll leave the final word on the cultural role of storytelling and the lived experience of Highlanders to John Francis Campbell, who devoted so much of his life to Gaelic. There on winter nights, children with wandering eyes and mouths agape sat in the ruddy light of the peat fire under the canopy of smoke and listened breathless to these weird old myths. They ceased to be ragged, bare-legged lads and lasses with shock hair, heads of dark or flaxen fair, unkempt, and probably should be hair, unkempt and unshorn. They hear how the bold bard fought the dragon and won the princess and the kingdom, and their spirits are up and doing like him. Potatoes and milk, wooden noggins, and good horn spoons cease to exist, while the golden basin and giant stores are spread before them by the eloquent voice and gesture of some gray, wrinkled old man. And when the story ends and the fire burns low, and they coil themselves up to rest in their crib, lads and lasses dream on, and so they dream until they grow up and grow old, and the old tale becomes a part of their quiet lives. That's quite a beautiful and eloquent portrayal, I think, a word picture there of the act of storytelling as he saw it so many times on his travels. And finally, sorry about this, a bit of an advert here about some of the other books that I've written. And I teach online. I'm now teaching a storytelling, which is why I started this book project in the first place, which is there at the URL at the bottom of the page, hiddenglenfolk.org. So that is my very quick and short overview of Gaelic storytelling, and particularly as I work through the texts for this particular book. Very happy to entertain questions and comments and thoughts, but I will let Craig and Duncan mediate. Tapale Gamal.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent. I got a lot out of that personally, and I learned so much from your very insightful overview and your contextual work there. So I thank you for that.
I hope the connection was okay. I hope you didn't lose any sound or video or anything.
No, I checked in with the chat. We had a lot of thumbs up, and there was a few moments where your little signal bars dropped a wee bit, but we never lost you completely. And I think the recording will show that it was all good. So can I just invite everyone to thank Michael first of all before we take any questions? For those of you that want to appear on screen now, you're welcome to, or to just say so in the chat. But I'll certainly thank Michael for his excellent paper. It's a very strange thing as a Zoom applause, but it has the same intention as a real life one. So yeah, we'll start fielding questions and comments now, if that's all right, Michael. As you've said, I'll see if anyone else wants to put their hand up. I'll try and figure out the gallery view here so I can see anyone with their hand up. I did see a question on the chat, which I hope I've not lost. I think it was someone asking if, yeah, Jesse, do you have a favourite tale? So we may as well start with that, Michael, if you don't mind, if you have a favourite tale that you want to say any more about.
Well, there were quite a few that are really fun or interesting in various ways. The tale that I had a friend send to me, because it's in a very rare source, that was collected in Nova Scotia in 1938, I think is really interesting, and I really like it a lot, just because it appeals to the nerdy, literary critic in me and my work on kind of Gaelic literary tradition. That it is kind of like one of these medieval magical quests where somebody goes off to a foreign land to collect something that they need to give them more power. And in this case, in Gaelic, people who know medieval Gaelic tradition will know about this figure named Shenachan. And it's after Shenachan that the term Shenachas, which means kind of like lore and knowledge, was named. He has 3 sons, and they are concerned that his father is missing the knowledge that he needs to be the most powerful, member of the literati. And so they go off in this quest to Scotland to this person named Gowan and Scale, the smith of stories. And they basically trick him into telling them information that they bring back to Ireland to give their father, so that he can become, the most important poet. And then he plays a trick on the smith, who's trying to catch up with him and kind of prevent him from doing that. That relates to a really interesting gender bending story in Gaelic. So it's kind of all this big mishmash of kind of nerdy allusions to literary material. So that's kind of fun. Another one that I like a lot is a story that was collected from Strathbran on kind of the eastern edge of the Highland Perthshire. And it's about King James V, who used to go around disguised as a beggar. And he meets this old man who's pulling heather. He's kind of collecting the heather so he can sell it. And every time he pulls a bit of heather, he says, "Oh, Adam." And the king says, "Why are you saying this?" And he says, "Well, if it weren't for Adam, I wouldn't be working by the sweat of my brow to make money and to earn bread." And so the king basically tricks him to go back to Scone Palace to sell the heather to him and to test how much better he is than Adam, actually. So it's a very fun story. I won't give away the rest of it. But I have, like I said, I've tried to represent the breadth of material, because nowadays, few people realize that people were telling stories in Gaelic in Strathbran in the, in the 19th century, but there were plenty of Gaelic speakers there. Yeah, and there's a lot of fun tales and spooky tales and tales about history and so on. I hope that there's something for everybody. Not everything is going to appeal to everybody, but hopefully there's something to appeal to everybody.
Sounds like there definitely is, Michael. Thanks so much for that full answer. Caroline, can I put you on the spot and ask you to ask Michael your question in person, if that's all right? Because it was a great question. If you want to unmute yourself and ask.
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering if there were any adaptations in English, like modern translations of a lot of these Scottish Gaelic stories, like they have for the Mabinogion, the Welsh texts, for those of us who are not, able to read Scottish Gaelic.
Right, so that's what the book is. That's what the forthcoming book is doing. It's giving, good modern editions of the primary texts in Gaelic, and then giving good modern translations into modern English of these texts. So it's, it's a representative group of texts. It's a fairly sizable book, but it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much great material out there, and I certainly hope that this will make good materials available to people, and will also just point out the need to do more of this work.
Since you mentioned the book, Michael, I think someone has asked when it will be available for purchase, and I don't think I was specific in my introduction. Can you say any more about that?
Well, just a few days ago, I submitted my revisions to the proofs. I know that you can pre-order it. You can spend money now but get it later, but you can also just wait until it's out. I've been asked to come to tell stories at the Edinburgh International Storytelling Festival in October, and hope to launch the book there. So there should be copies in person there in October, but it should be available well before then. But I can't tell you exactly when.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, publishers, and I can't speak for all of them, but a good number of them are sometimes vague about these things for some reason. Maybe they like to be mysterious. And someone's asking where you can get this, and Duncan has posted a link. So if you look in the chat, there's a link to McFarlane's website where you can get it, and I'm assuming that's the best place, Michael, if you would recommend the same. There's a good few. Sorry, go ahead.
Of course, it does depend on what continent or what country you're in. It's probably the cheapest way, of course, will be just to buy the ebook version. I personally don't like reading off of a screen when I don't have to. I like having something material in my hands. And McFarlane is based in the US. They do say they have agreements with UK distributors. I don't really know anything about that in particular, though. So yeah, it depends on where you're at.
Yeah. There's a good few questions in the chat I can certainly sieve through and pick out, but does anyone want to come forward and speak to Michael directly about anything they found interesting? You're certainly welcome to do that. I think it's probably a better way, but I will go back to the chat if anyone wants to. Yeah, Rebecca, if you want to unmute yourself, and then I think it should be at the bottom left of your screen. There should be a little icon for it. There we go.
I've got it. Michael, hello dear. It's a long time since I've seen you. Do you remember me, Rebecca Mackay from Rassie?
Well, have a second go shifsa.
Well, you've just made me realise, and I missed the start of it because my computer was acting up, but one of the things you've made me realise is because of the lack of proper Caelies as we used to have, that it's time I started writing down the things I remember that happened in my youth, because there's no other way of transmission now. It's very sad to say that we've been overtaken by the incomer who they just don't value our culture and our history and our language. Thank you very much, Michael.
Agus hamir san rag an fachami video ye va hum back in Hachkanyin, a garish round Manahion.
Well, and you mean my brain is Gaelic.
I was just saying that I saw a video of you a few weeks ago. So I saw a video of you a few weeks ago reciting a rhyme.
About the bird, about the thrush. Well, thanks for that. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure I'm going to read the rest of it when I manage to do that. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of it. Computers.
I think that, you know, what you're saying has been true for the last 100 years. Like, you see people writing into the periodicals in the 19th century saying, you know, the Cayley is stopped, and the only way that this is going to be preserved is if I sit down and write it down, and then I'll send it into the, you know, to this paper or that paper so that other people can see it.
Well, we've been very fortunate here, Michael. We were very good at caling until the hotel opened and the pub opened, and that sort of spoiled it. And then, of course, with all the incomers, when you did have a bit of a caling, they couldn't quite understand what you were about. So we have to find a way of making sure that our stories stay alive, and especially the more modern things that I remember as a child, and I'm now 76, so I remember quite a lot.
Well, thank you. There is still so much work to be done. So I'm very, very happy that you're around and you want to do some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, dear. Bye just now.
Happily. So I see the question about the page that I showed on one of the screens, and yes, it was from the Alexander Carmichael archives. So one of the things that makes work on the archives that he left so challenging is that he would sometimes have he used the same page in different orientations. He would write the page full of notes, and then he'd turn it 90 degrees and then write some more notes. And then nowadays, people who had worked in the archives at Edinburgh University on a big project I think it was about 10 years ago, had to do a lot of complex transcriptions working with these pages that were very difficult to work with. And I think, again, what he generally did was he would take notes, just kind of brief summaries as people were speaking, and then afterwards, from memory, he would reconstruct the story and use those working notes. And so, yeah, some of them are extremely difficult to decipher. Another really interesting field worker was John Dewar. And John Dewar, he was from the Lennox, an area south of Otherworld, and just kind of off the west of Loch Lomond side. And he was a self-taught man, and he began to do these transcriptions, and he invented his own form of shorthand so that he could try to write fast enough to transcribe as the speakers were telling the story. And then later on, he would go from his shorthand notes and write them out more fully, write the story out more fully. But as I understand it, he also did a certain amount of reconstructing from memory.
The memory aspect's fascinating. I'd like to know more about that, but we've got a few questions on screen, I think. Donald and Dana, I'll go to Donald first, if that's all right, because your hand was more persistent, if you don't mind me saying. So if Donald, if you want to ask your question.
Natürlich Männchen. I enjoyed that very much, Horder and Gomor.
You mentioned Father Alan MacDonald of Eust and Ersky. He was a kinsman. I wonder if his contribution in his collection of, shall we say, folkways, to generalize it, and his writing of poetry and hymns has prevailed to this day.
Well, he certainly is very important for the work that he did particularly in those islands. And I've got, I think, 3 or 4 texts in my book that he wrote. And to me, the most interesting of these is one of the Fenian tales that has never been translated before, because it has mention of genitalia, of bestiality, of fornication, and I think there might be something else in there. So this is really interesting. This is a Catholic priest who is able to obtain these texts from his parishioners, who gave him enough, well, they must have felt comfortable enough with him to allow him to write this down. And it's just kind of been sitting in original Gaelic form for well over a century, because it's just been too racy for people to deal with, I think, since then. So that to me is kind of an interesting side note on these whole issues about, what kind of stories were people talking about, what their sense of kind of, good language or racy language, or what their kind of norms were compared to the contemporary Anglophone world, which had been, kind of coming under the effects of this much more restrictive, puritanical Anglophone society. But he wrote quite a few good materials which have not been all brought together. And he was involved kind of in this larger project of cultural reclamation with Alexander Carmichael and others. And they, between themselves, were exchanging their manuscripts. So some of what we have that he wrote actually survives in other places. And then you have the case of, what was her name? I can't remember. Goodrich Freer, who basically took a bunch of materials from him and then published it under her name. So he's probably not got the kind of attention that he deserves and thanks that he deserves for what he did.
Thank you very much, Michael, for answering that one. Dana, do you want to ask your one? And I hope I've got your one right.
Sure, I can try and articulate it. I'm from Nova Scotia, so I'm interested in sort of how the storytelling tradition after the diaspora evolved with Nova Scotian storytellers, and if there's sort of like an ambiguous line there where you can't really tell where the literature or the oral tradition changed to be more specific to that experience of Scots in the Maritimes. And if there's any, like if you came across that, or if most of the stories are specific to the Highlands and then people retold them in Nova Scotia. I'm just trying to understand how it changed or how it evolved once after the diaspora. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so these are really interesting questions, and not enough attention has been really focused on these kinds of questions, because I mean there's hardly any scholars who have the resources to do it. I mean, in all of Canada, there are maybe 2 people doing these things with Scottish Gaelic, and also just there was a lot more of this work being done in Scotland during the 19th century when the traditions were so much stronger. In Nova Scotia, you have just a few tales collected in the, well, you did have the periodical Nachtala from, I think it was 1892 to about 1906, something like that. And several stories appeared there, and also references to storytelling. There was also roughly at that time a few columns that appeared in newspapers where stories occasionally appeared. Then in the 1920s, you start getting a little bit of story collecting, but then, and a little bit in the 1930s. It's not until the 1940s and 50s that people are bringing equipment and starting to record a few more. And then in the 1970s, you have much more focused work being done by people like John Shaw. And John Shaw has a very good article trying to give some sense of overview about these things. I can't remember what it's called now, something like Immigrant Sea Change or something like that. So he's trying to look at this question a bit, but I think there's a lot more that can be done by looking at these resources like MacEdward Leach he recorded a number of stories. I think it was in the 1950s. And there's a few more resources like that are starting to be kind of recognized. But there just wasn't the same number of people collecting stories and writing them down and preserving them so that we could ask that question in full. We're gonna have to sort of extrapolate when somebody actually has time to do that work.
So maybe be available to attend some Céilís in Cape Breton and start transcribing again, I guess, because people are still.
Well, that line of transmission is pretty much gone. You would have had to been here 50 years ago to know. It's very attenuated. There was, like I said, John Shaw doing that collection, especially with Joe Neal McNeill and Scale Galah, Tales to Dawn. That's the biggest reclamation that's been done. And Joe Neal McNeill died over 20 years ago. He was kind of the last of the big storytelling tradition bearers. And he had a few contemporaries who had some stories that were recorded. And you might be able to find people who might be able to say, oh, my grandfather told tales, or my grandfather told about Céilís and what certain kinds of tales were told, but you're just not going to get those stories anymore. They're just not there.
Right. Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. And so I think, one of the kinds of interesting questions that I think, again, as I recall, John Shaw is trying to look at is, what kind of stories. Now, initially, all these immigrants brought the exact same stories with them, but certain kinds of stories would have maybe be seen as less relevant or, less popular over time, and others more popular. So, for example, stories about the fairies survived, and there are places, like I said, called Scotian, and there are stories about people who, learned their fiddle tunes or their fiddle skills from fairies. But there were also other kinds of creatures as well. There was the Achushka and Haravushka and Urishk. And I don't think that these other beings, even though there's lots of water around here and there are beings that were in watery places, I don't think that they survived nearly as well as the Scotian did. So why is that the case? Like, there's so much more research that can be done. I think that, like in the Highlands, there's lots of stories about, clan chieftains and clan sagas and various warriors involved in various battles. There are a few of those in Nova Scotia, but my impression, and again, we just don't know for sure, but my impression is that those stories just did not speak, they weren't just seen quite as relevant here as they were in Scotland. So they didn't survive nearly as well here as they did in Scotland. Other genres like international folktale, it seems like that was quite popular here because, it's a kind of genre that goes over well with an audience at Céilís of many different ages. So, again, the storytelling tradition has many genres, has many themes and strands within it. And we can kind of be more fine-grained about, what kind of stories are people telling and why and this kind of thing. Or that they used to. Latterly, the genre that prevailed the best and the most is kind of the tall tale. We're talking about, fishing and hunting and that sort of thing. But that's quite different that was not kind of the prevailing genre in the 19th century Highlands, for example.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
There's still
I want to apologize that I was very kind of nervous and distracted at the beginning because the technology, I was just so worried about the technology failing. It was really hard for me to just relax and read my script. So I apologize about that.
Oh, not at all, Michael. I think we've all really, really enjoyed what you've given us. And as you can see from the chat, you've been responding so well, so you won't have the chance, but there's lots of links being shared. There's still new questions coming through, lots of enthusiasm. So I think everyone's pretty happy with how it's going. So thanks again. I would encourage everyone to check out these plenty of great links. And I think actually I'm able to share these links later on because this is a recorded session. I might distribute them later on if that's okay. Shannon, you've just appeared on screen because your question seems to have gotten a cosign or two. There are questions on Burns and on comparisons between Icelandic and Gaelic stories. We'll get to them too, I hope. But I wonder, Shannon, if you want to ask your question, because it was very interesting.
Yeah, Harokesh Thakam. I don't think I had a question, but I was just dropping in links as I heard Michael making references to things that I knew about and could share with folks who
Of
didn't
course.
so far.
You know, it's my bad reading. I've got you mixed up with Sorsha, who did ask a question about textile history. So apologies, Shannon, but I'm glad you were able to you know, take the credit for all these great links that you're sharing. Sorsha, now that you're here, do you want to speak to Michael? Is that all right?
Yeah, smashing. Fisker ma avihu. So I am currently in the process of becoming a textile historian with a primary focus on Gael folk costume. Specifically, I'm interested in gender performance within folk costume and kind of opening that space up to gender non-conforming people within modern Gael culture. And I wanted to know if you think that folk stories can be used as an authoritative source for studying traditional dress.
Well, the complication is always that you have to keep in mind that the storyteller is interpreting tradition through a contemporary lens. So let's say that you're talking about a story that was recorded in the 19th century, transcribed in the 19th century, about something that happened in the 17th century, right? And in that case, you're going to be having a mixture of things that might reflect some aspects of the 17th century, but it's being refracted through the experience of somebody who lives in the 19th century. So you're never going to get just like a perfect snapshot or fossilized kind of capture of what the 17th century was, because oral tradition is always adapting to people's contemporary lived experiences. So that's kind of a major caveat, I would say. But you know, there are some interesting details about clothing in some of the stories. Probably a better source really is song poetry, because the song poetry tends to be more stable, because between alliteration and rhyme, it just means that texts are just more stable than prose is. In the back of my mind, I'll see if I can remember anything of that nature. Nothing is coming directly to mind at the moment in terms of what appears in these stories, but if you heard the talk that I gave on the podcast called Not Work Storytelling, and I see that Marissa, who runs the podcast, is with us, you'll know that I talked about a story in which a male changes into a female and then back to a male. And that is one of the stories that is in the book, or sorry, that is kind of a motif that is in one of the stories in the book. But it's not necessarily, it doesn't give you details about, well, exactly what clothing were they wearing and that sort of thing. But certainly, you know, you can glean some aspects of material culture, but there was such a huge change in material culture between the 19th century and the 17th century that you're not going to get a perfect kind of, you know, information capture, download, as it were, you know, that you're getting it through the lenses of somebody living in the 19th century. And Marissa, since you're there, I wonder if you want to put a link there to your podcast so that people can know about it, because it's quite a great resource. You got it there. Thank you, Craig. So I hope that was a good summary. I know it's probably not as satisfying as one might like.
I think everyone's happy. It's funny, I'll just briefly interject just to take the heat off you, Michael. You've got a lot of questions coming at you. So one of the things that's fascinated me throughout your talk is this reliance on memory. I'm more of an 18th century scholar, and mostly in Scots or in Scottish culture through English language. But the thing that when I look at The Gentle Shepherd by Alan Ramsay, for example, I've been working on that a lot. And in the 1788 version, so published 30 years after Ramsay's death, the Fowlis brothers of Glasgow who were quite foundational, I think, in the city for publishing Gaelic texts as well. They had put forward a new edition of the Gentle Shepherd, and it's funny because the preface said a lot about the way that the dress was supposed to represent the way it was, but of course, people who weren't au fait with Ramsay's body of work wouldn't have known at the time that it was a Restoration period text, so it was supposed to be a 17th century thing, but the artists were using an 18th century example to re-inscribe or remember an aesthetic that was supposed to be for essentially a late 18th, early 19th century audience. And what they said as well was that there were shepherds in the county in the south of Edinburgh who would remember Ramsay's songs, and when we looked at the literary tourism, that just didn't seem to be the case. You know, this invented idea that Ramsay could be shoehorned into what you might see here as a legitimate Gaelic culture where the songs are part of the oral tradition in a way that text or print-based editions such as Ramsay, such as Burns, although Burns to a lesser extent, actually fits into. So with that, I suppose I should redress you to Amity Harrington's question: how does Burns's poetry fit into this larger Celtic tradition, do you think? So if you have anything to say about Burns and Celtic, please do, but you know, this is one of these curveball questions that allows you to say something completely different, I think, if you want to.
Right, well, you know, this is interesting how so many people kind of portray Burns as the national poet of Scotland, whereas, you know, certainly from a Gaelic point of view, he's of a completely different ethno-linguistic heritage or tradition. So, you know, for example, so he was born in what, the 1750s or something, and his heyday was the later 1700s. And you already have people going from the Highlands to other destinations in North America by then, who you know, who left before his popularity was in the ascendancy. And many of them, and most of the people who came to Nova Scotia didn't know any English or Scots. So, you know, they would not see him as part of their tradition. And in fact, we have examples of people, tourists, coming to Nova Scotia in the late 1800s saying, oh, isn't Burns great? And they say, well, who are you talking about? We have no idea who you're talking about. Of course, though, by the early 1900s, more and more people in these Gaelic communities, such as Nova Scotia, are learning about Burns and learning about lowland literary tradition. And there's a really interesting example of a poet from Nova Scotia who wrote a poem called Duanak na Fiorek, the song of the squirrel, in which he is referring to Burns and kind of putting himself in dialogue with Burns's To a Mouse. So it's an interesting example of people being aware of the fact that there is this other literary representative that people are kind of expecting to be the exemplar of Scottish literary tradition that they want to sort of have this dialogue with.
Excellent, thank you. And I see Duncan's put a link up to your article on Burns and Highland culture from 2009. So have you got a question, Rebecca? Yeah, go ahead. I think you're still muted, Rebecca, sorry.
How's that now? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I was in Prince Edward Island in 2003, and I heard a gentleman say that the Gael came to Prince Edward Island with the Bible, the family Bible, and a copy of Robert Burns. Rather peculiar, I thought. But, however, having said that, there were two MacLeods from Rassay in Edinburgh, John and Isabel MacLeod, and they were well acquainted with Robert Burns, and in fact he wrote a poem to Isabel MacLeod.
Are you saying that they were personally friends with him or something, or?
Yes, they were in Edinburgh.
Well, the majority of Highlanders who came would not have been English speakers and would not have been familiar with him. Now, of course, some of the gentry would have been bilingual, and they may well have spent time in Edinburgh or other places where they encountered him. But for the majority of the majority of Scots and PEI were Highlanders who were Gaelic speakers who would not have considered that their tradition or their literature or their poetic representative.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that quote comes from, but I think it's a very problematic one.
I maybe didn't make myself clear in what I said about what I heard in Prince Edward Island. I mean, there's no way that anybody leaving here would have left with a copy of Robert Burns. They couldn't read English, never mind Scots.
And I don't know when his edition started to be published, but I think, I mean, some of the main groups coming came, I would think would have probably come before it was easily available in print anyway. But I could be wrong about that.
Well, from Raasay, they left just after Culloden, when the Redcoats came to Raasay and just ravaged the whole island. And there was a mass exodus of people then in the sort of late 1700s.
Thank you, Rebecca. I was going to come back to, I don't want to neglect, Donald Murray had asked a question quite early on about the similarities that you mentioned, Michael, between Icelandic and Gaelic stories. And if you could give any specific examples about those. They might not be in your notes, but I think that was the question Donald had asked. I think Donald's still here.
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yeah.
So, no, Tapalish, if you could tell me about connections. I was quite interested in that because when I've been to Iceland, I'm very much aware that half of the population seem very Hebridean. Of course, the DNA is that, and I could see that in some of the writing that I've encountered. Even Njal Saga has a kind of Gaelic feel to it. Njal being Neil, of course, it's a Gaelic name. So I'd be very interested here if there's what connections you've made.
Well, it is a very interesting question. I'm not that's not my area of expertise, so I'm really just drawing on others when I make these kinds of observations. Primarily, or in particular, John McInnes himself, and there's an Icelandic scholar whose name I don't remember, but he has looked at the ways in which Icelandic literature has been influenced by and draws from the Gaelic literary tradition as a whole. And by that, I'm inclusive of Ireland and Scotland. There's quite a number of, a huge amount of material to suggest that, of course, when the Norse encountered the Gaels already had a very mature literary tradition. And there were many aspects of that are being drawn upon in the development of Icelandic literary tradition, which is distinct from what was being developed in Norway and Sweden, and well, those are the modern countries anyway, and Scandinavia, we'll say, in Scandinavia. And one of the ways in which that appears in the material that I'm working on, or that you have this ritual exchange of taunt and insult and challenge, and this kind of laconic, bare, poetry that's being used. And it's not unlike the kind of thing you might have in, Hollywood film, where you have some hero saying something very pithy and very kind of biting, that is either something that they say as their last dying breath or to challenge the person who they have to have some fatal encounter with. So that's kind of one major way in which it shows up. But it's also, I have to say, the kind of thing you get in the native Gaelic sagas before the Icelandic, encounters, or before the Norse encounters. So it's something that seems to be shared in common which may point to, earlier influences from Gaels upon the Norse, if not just kind of a common stylistic tendency that they both shared.
Thanks, Michael. You're being very generous with your full answers here. Very grateful for that, and very grateful as the chair here to see such a fruitful discussion ongoing generally. Does anyone else have any more questions? Or anyone want to come forward with any comments? And apologies if I've missed. Oh, Brant, you had a question very early. Would you like to come forward and ask it, or will I find it in the chat? Apologies, maybe you can't come on screen.
If I could do it without a camera.
You can, yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, all right, great. Hello, Olive. I was recently looking at one of the collections of Sinclair, and I'd read an article that he had done quite a bit of heavy editing of some content that he didn't approve of. When you find things like that, are they primarily still found in manuscripts and living storytellers, or are you aware of much that's available in the public domain?
Oh, sorry, when you're talking about, there was kind of two ideas there. One was of editors modifying or expurgating, changing the text.
Right.
One was about the availability of texts in general, I think. So
availability of some of those texts that are more racy, because I'm unaware of how much was kind of strained through that disapproval. For instance, the poem that I found, it had, I think, the word blood edited out of it, and it was otherwise a very tame, seemed like a very tame poem. But where do you find those things? Is it just something that you stumble across?
Well, two places to start are, I did create this book called The Naughty Little Book of Gaelic, and I've got a lot of material in there, which is very racy. And then, who was it? I think it's McPherson, I can't remember his first name, Ian McPherson and Peter McKay edited and translated a book, which is, I think it's called Lord Leah, which is translated in English. I think the title is The Little Grey Book, Transgressive Gaelic Poetry or something like that. So
I think I found it.
Yeah, okay. So that's another good source to look at. And there's been a little bit of research of scholarship, in article form, talking about people such as MacLean Sinclair and the ways in which he modified the texts. Now, in terms of these racy texts, I think there's, again, a lot more work to be done. These two books that I've named already will look at poetry, song poetry. What I did in this book was, the oral narrative prose. And unfortunately, like one of the stories that's racy, I asked somebody at the National Library of Scotland to try to find the manuscript form because it's not printed in the book. And she was not able to find it. And of course, I haven't been able to get to Scotland to find it. So there's going to be bits like this appearing over time, hopefully. But it tells you that people did not have this kind of Victorian sensibility about not talking about genitalia and sex acts and things like that. Those are perfectly common things that you find in Gaelic tales of some sort, anyway.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that.
Yeah, and thanks to Rob Dunbar here, who has provided the title for the extensive study about Gaelic influence in Icelandic tradition.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So I had missed a question from Jess earlier on, so I've got the chance to ask it now, and it is, have you come across many queer stories? I think you might have touched on this a little bit in one of your earlier answers, Michael, but Jessie was curious in particular about stories that challenge the gender binary with which we're familiar today.
Well, I mean, the short answer is not many. And the reason, or one of the reasons you have to keep in mind is, how do we have the texts that we have? And most of the texts that we have were preserved by people, well, I mean, they were all preserved by people who were literate. And who were the people who were literate? Well, they were mostly ministers and priests. And they in general, people would have been careful about what they said to their ministers and priests. There are a few exceptions, such as those that I mentioned. But for the most part, that just by itself creates a kind of filter. These are mostly men. There are very few women that were literate and that were involved in things such as collecting folktales. And even if you had a woman collecting folktales, she's going to be mostly collecting them from men. And that in itself creates a kind of, tension. So you have certain just filters in the materials getting written down in the first place. And I think a certain, I think there would have been a limited amount of these materials for the reason also that by the time that they were being collected, the impact, the kind of, very hegemonic hold of churches in the Highlands would have had the influence of minimizing expression in various ways of alternative sexualities.
Thank you, Michael, again. I hope that answers the question. So there's a question just now that's come in. Can you see that okay, Michael?
Sorry, which one?
I'm trying to see if I can get this to appear on your screen as well. How do you feel about modern storytellers utilizing these stories and sharing them in English? Is it a valuable sharing of cultural treasure, or is it a form of appropriation? Good question.
So that's always it's always a tricky line. And to me, one of the issues is, who are you representing and for what purposes, and how are you discussing or revealing the degree to which you are relying upon tradition and changing it for your own purposes. So I think it's perfectly normal and natural that everything undergoes some kind of change and transformation. But are you being clear about, what the original form is and where it came from and how you have modified it, for your own purposes? So again, one of the reasons why I opened up with discussing how I understand folktales, what I understand it to mean in a Gaelic context is it represented the community's understanding of tradition and things that they were inheriting from their larger sense of identity and belonging. And I'm on Facebook and I'm a member of the Scottish Storytelling Forum. And I see that there's a lot of interest in storytelling, but a lot of it is very much based on individual creativity or individualized experiences and an expression of, individual identity and individual idiosyncrasies. Now, things like anecdotes and memories exist in Gaelic storytelling tradition, and they've always been around, but they tend to be very low status and very low priority in comparison to things that were understood to be part of the community's understanding of tradition and expression of the past and expression of, shared values and experiences. So that's quite different from, like the Moth Radio Hour for those that are in North America, people getting on a stage and saying what happened to them a year ago at the pub, for example. The personal experiences and the jokes and the memories they're interesting and they're a part of storytelling tradition, but they're very minimal and minor in comparison to the older genres and things that were endowed with a sense of kind of, age and prestige.
Excellent. Thank you. I think you've been put through enough paces tonight, Michael. I suppose we could always open up for one more, but I think you've shared more than enough, and the very good talk that you gave us was followed up by some more excellent details that I think everyone's benefited from. So, in lieu of a question, I'll just invite everyone to thank you again for not just a great talk, but great discussion afterwards. So thank you, Michael. Right, so I think we should draw to a close there. I'll certainly, before the Zoom link goes down, I'll capture all the great comments that are coming in, any questions that we might have missed as well. I think there might have been one or two, but I think we've tackled the big ones. And if anyone was asking about us being able to watch this back, yes, I will. This is being recorded. We will put it on our Association for Scottish Literature website, and hopefully the links will all survive too, and we can see, because there's a great amount of culture out there in terms of videos, transcriptions and so on, and also books, other scholarship, other commercial publications that have been shared. So we've got plenty to go on for the future. So thanks, Michael. Thanks everyone for being here, no matter what time zone you're in. I think we've got quite a good international audience tonight, and a healthy one at that. So thanks everyone, and we'll be in touch soon. Okay, and have a good day.
And Craig, I'll just mention really quickly that I know that sometimes the automatic transcriptions can get things wrong. So I can send you the script.
That's great.
If there's any way to sort of like do fix the problems, the autocorrect.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can ask you more details about this later, but I could even just put the script on as well. We could have it as a downloadable item so that people can have your script as well as listening to it. I think that would be a good idea, if you're okay with that.
Great.
Okay. Right. Thanks for that. Good idea, Michael. Thanks, everyone.